Time for the debate now. To call it a crisis is something of an understatement. Greece has no government. It could run out of cash as early as next month. Now, Greece did, of course, agree to the terms of a second international bailout earlier this year. But the government that signed off on that deal is now out of power after an election that punished mainstream parties and put extremists in parliament for the first time. Well, here's a look at what the Greek parliament is made up of right now. As you can see, no party has enough to rule. The winning party was the Conservative New Democracy Party, but with a poor 19% of the vote, they said yesterday they couldn't manage to form a coalition. Well, all of this uncertainty, as you can imagine, has had a terrible effect on markets. This is the euro tanking today against the pound and the dollar, at a 3.5-year low against the pound and a 5-month low against the dollar. Here you can see the Athens Stock Exchange down 3.5% today. That after it fell 7% yesterday. Those losses put it at a near 2-decade low. Now, this man has 3 days to form a government. 37-year-old Alexis Tsipras has a far-left party that quadrupled its support in the elections at the weekend. He now wants to create a leftist coalition that will release Greece from its obligations. Well, the reaction from the international community has been one of alarm, with Germany in particular calling on Greece to honour the terms of its deal.
The reforms agreed upon must continue. We are convinced that overcoming the debt crisis is not only a matter of European solidarity, which we are prepared to fulfill, but also a matter of Greece's efforts and reliability. That is why it is so important for us to see the steps for consolidation we have agreed upon implicated. They are not up for discussion.
Well, meanwhile, centrist pro-European politicians in Greece are calling for calm.
I believe that it is of great importance to maintain the stability, the confidence, and the solidarity to conclude the effort to rectify the economy, so that the sacrifices of the Greek people will not be wasted.
As expected, on the streets of Athens today, a lot of concern about what will happen next.
Results like this are just too bad. It's hard to form a stable government under such a bad situation.
All these thieves need to come to their senses.
I don't think they'll cooperate, at least not for now. This poor country never had the chance to have someone who really cares for it. All these politicians only care for themselves.
The far-left leader Alexis Tsipras charged with forming a government. He has 3 days as from today, and this is what he says are his conditions.
The popular verdict clearly renders the bailout deal null and void. After receiving the mandate today for the formation of a coalition government, we will enact everything that we promised before elections. We will resubmit our proposal for a government of the left.
And let's have a quick look at what he is demanding if he's to work with any of the mainstream parties, and he will need to work with some of them if he's to form a coalition. He wants the immediate cancellation of all impending salary and pension cuts. He wants to cancel all impending measures that undermine workers' rights, and he wants to abolish a law which grants MPs immunity from prosecution. He also wants an investigation into Greek banks and the immediate publication of an audit performed on the Greek banking sector. Finally, he wants to set up an international auditing committee to investigate why Greece is in such a mess. So, who is the politician that can lead the Greek people out of this mess, and is default and an exit from the Eurozone now inevitable? Well, joining me to discuss tonight, Craig Capitas is here with me in the studio. He's a Paris-based journalist and the author of Bear Hunting with the Politburo. Good evening to you, Craig. Good evening. With us. In Athens tonight, Thrassi Petropoulos is the chief editor of Athens News. He'll be telling us the very latest on what's going on there. Good evening to you, Thrassi.
Good evening.
Over in Washington, D.C., Tyson Barker is the Director of Transatlantic Relations at the Bertelsmann Foundation. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
And in London, Ambrose Evans-Pritchard is the International Business Editor for the Telegraph newspaper. Thanks for being with us, Ambrose, as well. Now, let's start.
Hello, yes, nice to be with you, yeah.
Good to have you. Now, let's start in Athens, where the action's still very much going on, isn't it, Thasri? Talks are underway. How likely is it that Tsipras will be able to form a far-left coalition?
It's highly unlikely at this stage is the short answer. It's a very, very complicated answer to give in detail. Effectively, he doesn't have, the numbers just are not going to add up in his favour. Most of that is to do with the way the electoral law is set up here, where the leading party gets a bonus 50 seats, and he's obviously in charge of the second party. So they're in the 50s, and there just aren't enough seats on the left to make that happen. In fact, they're a long way short. The left in Greece is historically unable to actually come together at the best of times, and these are far from the best of times.
Are we looking at another election then on June 17th? Is that your feeling that is going to happen at this stage?
Yeah, it's hard to see anything else. I mean, he's got 3 days, and it's no... You know, we can't rule out the fact that someone's going to do a huge about turn on the basis that you know, we're likely to fall apart if the memorandum goes out the window. But all of the talk from Tsipras and other left-wing parties has been that they don't want this bailout memorandum, and therefore it's going to have to be settled by another poll. That's, I think, the only way that it's going to go.
Craig Kapitas, the resounding message that we're getting here is the Greek people do not want to pay back this debt, at least at the terms being demanded by the IMF and the European Union.
That's certainly what the vote showed. I mean, when you reach a situation when you have Nazis working with communists, that's a real prescription for disaster, and particularly when it's in a country that, you know, where you have more political parties now than you have investment capital. The situation in Greece is sadly devolved greatly. I was there over the weekend, and it was rather quite shocking. You have old men who are accustomed to having young men listen to them, the PASOK elders, the New Democracy elders, and they sit in their comfortable chairs. They're not being listened to anymore, and that's another reason. I always called it the Papouli Conference, your father. You always have to listen to what your father's telling you in Greece. This is not happening there now. And it would appear that the trend, which started over a year ago, well over a year ago, that Greece will go drachma. Not because it wants to, but it's just going to fall out their way. There is no leadership in Greece.
All right. Ambrose Evans-Pritchard, as we can see from the reaction on the markets today, this is a very worrying situation for the entire Eurozone. Ambrose Evans-Pritchard, you with us?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very dangerous moment. I mean, Greece has to sort of meet bond payments, you know, this month. I mean, it has to make decisions over the coming days, over the next weeks. If it fails to do so, it will default. There's obviously no functioning government. You know, it's quite clear that they could just snowball very, very quickly, you know, into full default, a banking crash, and EMU expulsion, you know, within weeks, the way this is going. And the problem is that there are certain people in key positions in Europe who quite like to see that happen. In other words, you know, they want to make an example of Greece. They feel it's misbehaved, you know, to discipline the country, to force it out of EMU. But I think that would just set off an uncontrollable chain reaction. It would cause mass deposit of flight from other countries like Portugal and Spain. The whole Eurozone system, I think, would blow up very, very quickly.
What then is the alternative? Because the way it looks right now, no politician in Greece is going to be able to get into power if they're saying that they will proceed with the austerity measures. They will continue to cut spending.
I mean, I don't see that the position is completely, you know, impossible. I don't see how they can form a government of any kind. I think it's a completely extraordinary situation, and you know, refusing to accept the memorandum means automatically, essentially, the plug's going to be pulled on them. by the EU and the IMF, I don't see you can meet these terms. I mean, an end to austerity, an end to cuts, you can't meet those terms. The EU is simply going to walk out on them, and they don't seem to fully accept this. They seem to think they can kind of have it both ways. Maybe I'm underestimating them, but I spoke to Syriza people when I was in Athens a month ago or so, and they still seem to think they could have it both ways. Well, they can't. I mean, if they don't accept the memorandum, and I completely understand and appreciate why they wouldn't want to do so, that means the drachma. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Therese, if I can come back to you. In your view, are Greeks more worried about leaving the euro and whatever that might entail, or are they more worried about more austerity, more cuts, more hardship?
Well, this is the extraordinary thing about the situation as it is today, because at the time that the second bailout was being negotiated, the opinion polls were taken as to what people actually wanted. We obviously didn't have the famous referendum that led to George Papandreou stepping down. But when these opinion polls were taken, 70% of the population said that they wanted the euro, they wanted to be part of the eurozone, and they want to be part of the EU. And that's just not reflected in a vote where over 50% have said that they are supporting anti-memorandum parties. Look, the one thing I would say is that we've been taken to the brink so many times in this debt crisis, going right back to May 2009 when it all escalated here. And at each and every time, somehow we seem to have been taken right to the brink and then take a step back. There is a slight get-out clause in this, where if we have another round of elections, you know, they weren't very far away, PASOK and New Democracy, from getting a majority. And probably what I think a lot of people expected was that one of the left parties would have gone with them, Democratic left perhaps. They haven't gone with them there. It's not impossible that that will happen a second time, because what's being proposed now simply does not add up. And it is true that if what Mr. Tsipras is proposing comes off, we were told in no uncertain terms that Germany just won't accept that.
It's a pretty big if, though, isn't it, Craig Kapitas? If Greek voters will change their minds if they're given another chance in the election.
Well, I agree that it's going to be June 17th. We're going to see another round of elections, and I don't see much difference here. I just think you look at that pie chart of the number of parties. It's chaos and confusion. What needs to be done in Greece is a leader needs to be found. And so far, no leader has emerged from this rubble. And for my way of thinking, that's the most concerning thing here. You still see a lot of leadership within the Greek business community there. Many of the CEOs of the shipping companies, et cetera, et cetera. You see leadership within the young people within, for instance, the Greek Foreign Service, who have ideas, who are still being shut out. You actually see leadership ability for hope in Greece, places like the Stavros Nirakos Foundation, which is a foundation in Greece that a lot of people laugh at because they think, well, Nirakos was a rich man. But the people who run this foundation and other foundations and other institutions there have not been included in this process of recreating a new Greek state to get the country out of this mess. And that, when the autopsy is done on the failure of Greece, I think is going to be a real point that people are going to look at seriously.
They're out of ideas. All right, let's go to Washington now. Tyson Barker's there at the Bertelsmann Foundation North America. Some pretty stark choices facing the Greeks at the moment.
That's completely the case. I mean, just to give you a sense of how things are here in Washington, on Super Sunday, the election day in Europe, the discussion wasn't really about the French elections as much as it was about the Greek elections. And I just came from Capitol Hill, where the prognosis of the Greek situation has changed dramatically in the past week. A week ago, people were really thinking that the possibility that Greece would leave the Eurozone was about 20%. Now it's really more like 50-50. And one thing that we're not even talking about really is the fact that the EU as an organization doesn't really have a mechanism for a country to leave the Eurozone. It has a mechanism for a country to leave the EU. And there are all sorts of implications that would come from that. You'd have to leave Schengen, there would have to be capital controls introduced, a whole number of things. Here in Washington, we're thinking about its wider implications across the Eurozone, but also its strategic implications for the region. I mean, Greece is really a pivot point between the Balkans, between Turkey, between the Arab Spring. This could be a really destabilizing factor in the entire region.
Ambrose, in London, as Tyson points out, this is unprecedented. There is no kind of how-to-do list to let a country leave the Eurozone. Do you think they would have to leave the Eurozone and the EU as well?
The EU is a very flexible organisation, and when they ran into difficulties, whether it was over the Irish nose to Nice or whatever it was, the Danish nose to Maastricht, they found a way around it. They very clever lawyers, they'll come up with a formula. So I would think it's possible to leave the euro and stay in the EU. The question is whether some of the powers that be in Europe might want to push Greece out, to feel they behaved badly and to make an example of them. That, so it would be a political decision. I think legally and constitutionally, they can basically do whatever they want in this case. And I just want to add a point here that Greece is not a special case in my view. It's the first of a series of countries that got into trouble, but the same dynamic is basically at play in a number of others. There's debt deflation. It's essentially a 1930s gold standard structure where all the burden of adjustment is on the weaker countries, and they're all being ground into this death spiral. And so what we're seeing in Greece will be followed in Portugal and will be followed in Spain until the policy mix that is monetary and fiscal contraction combined is changed. It's as simple as that.
Are you saying the euro should be scrapped altogether?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying if you want to keep it and make it work, you need to change the policy mix. The policy mix has been contractionary. It was imposed by, I don't want to be anti-German about it, but it's basically coming from Germany. And it was okay for German needs because they're at a different stage of the economic cycle, but it was completely disastrous for countries with high debt levels already in recession. And so this is an inevitable result of the policies that have been pursued and can be changed.
And would that mean renegotiating the terms of repayment for Greece? I mean, already 100 billion euros has been written off. Is that something that Brussels should be looking at again?
Well, I mean, specifically, if you change the whole policy setting in Europe for all these countries and give them oxygen and a way out, then the Greek issue becomes a detail, and maybe you could find some formula and you could negotiate. I think the IMF actually is more open. They recognise that this policy is flawed. It's essentially a failure. They've been pleading behind closed doors with the EU to change it. Haven't had much luck. So I think you could work something out. But I mean, that's not, changing slightly the terms for Greece, unless the whole policy mix for Europe is changed, isn't going to make any difference.
All right. Let's hold that thought. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll have the international headlines for you and the second part of tonight's debate. Don't go away.